You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
And welcome back to WCDB Albany. My name is Eric Hardiman, and I'm here with Alyssa Lotmore for the Social Workers Radio Talk Show. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hi, Eric. It's so I can't believe another semester is already starting.
I know. It's hard to believe, right?
So, for those who don't know about the show, we're the Social Workers Radio Talk Show. We've been on the air several years, and our mission is to use the medium of radio to educate and enlighten our university and extended community members about social work trends and current practices provided by social workers. So we are on live once a month usually, and then we have pre-recorded episodes that will play on automation. So we're always trying to have the new topics that are, popular to the community. What do you want to hear about? And make that available to the public. So we have students on, we have alums on, we have community members on, and we're hopefully hitting the areas of social work that you want to know about.
And one thing that's been really, if you're just tuning in for the first time, one of the things that we love about the Social Workers Radio Talk Show here is that the topics we talk about relate to social work, but they also relate outside of social work, so that people, if you're listening in the community and you don't know what social work is, or if you're not a social worker yourself or not interacting with social workers, the topics that we talk about are socially relevant topics. We may be talking about racism. We may be talking about social justice. We may be talking about voting, which today we will be talking about voting for the next hour or so.
Perfect for primary day.
Perfect for primary day. Today is Thursday, primary day here in New York State, and it's exciting. Another electric day when people are at the polls, hopefully voting, and voting is our topic for the day. But the point being that if you're tuning in, the Social Workers Radio Talk Show is about more than just social work practice. It's about issues that relate to social work and how social workers may intervene, but also how communities can change.
So I always look at it as the public is client, and that's one of the things that we like to see. How do we reach individuals who may never have considered seeing or using a social worker? And how do we get that message across? A lot of it's about advocacy and raising awareness. So today, what we're going to be talking about is voting. Our topic is voting as social work, and we have two guests today. We have Dr. Mary McCarthy, who is of the University at Albany School of Social Welfare, so one of our own. She'll be talking about this Voting is Social Work campaign and how the university and schools of social work and universities in general can bring more awareness to voting and why it's important for students to become engaged. And after that, we'll have Joe Bonilla, who I'll introduce later, and talk a little bit about politics from the political side, as campaigns and polling.
And just as a quick reminder to our listeners, before we start our interview, Alyssa, maybe you could tell the listeners how folks can tune in to the show if they're not listening live. There's some ways you can stream our show. You can find our show, I believe, on YouTube.
Yes, we do have our channel on YouTube where we can have all our archive shows. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at Social Workers FM. And we also have a website. If you go on the University at Albany's webpage, www.albany.edu/the-social-workers, and you can find us there.
Great. So we're very excited and honored to have Dr. Mary McCarthy here with us today. Dr. McCarthy is the director of the bachelor's program in social work in the School of Social Welfare on the downtown campus of the University at Albany, and as a longtime social worker and advocate. And welcome to the show, Mary.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Alyssa. It's really great to be here.
And I always like to say Mary is like the voting expert at the school. If there's any question about voting, I'm always like, see Mary. So we're going to jump right into this. And we're going to, Dr. McCarthy is going to focus a little bit on how voting relates to higher ed and students. So let's just say, why is voting important for undergrads who may not always see the connection between maybe politics and their lives? Why is it important for undergrads and even graduate students to get involved on their campus with voting and registering to vote?
Well, I think one of the responsibilities of a university is really to create the kind of space we need for the discussion of different ideas. And through that discussion, we should become better informed citizens. So part of that citizen responsibility is really voting. In a democracy, it's a right that we have. I think we forget that because we've had that right for such a long time that if we don't exert that right, it can really be taken away from us. So part of, I think, the responsibility of a university is to help students understand what are our responsibilities as we become citizens in our communities, in our state, in our country, and in our world.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to realize that, sometimes I hear that, oh, my vote doesn't count, or I don't need to go vote, or, it's a shoo-in who will win this election. And that's not always the case, as we've seen in the past. So what can we do to help students and, the public in general realize that that's not the case?
Yeah, I think that's a kind of cynical view about our voice. And right now, there's so much shouting and yelling going on that I think we forget the power of taking a stand, taking a position, expressing our position through voting. In a particular race, it may not make a difference. There may be overwhelming support for a particular candidate that might not be the person we vote for. I think the Attorney General's election right now is a great example. There are 4 candidates running. So depending on who you choose, you may feel like your vote didn't count.
Right.
But the fact that everyone expresses their opinion helps us to know that the person that got elected is the best person for the job.
It's an interesting perspective. If I could interrupt you for a second, Mary, one of the common things that I've heard from residents of New York, but also from students, is that our vote in New York, because we are a unique state and very much a blue state, may not matter. And there's the perception that if you vote for a candidate that New York State is not going to sway the country, for example. It's not a swing state. It's not a state of particular, that has that power. So when you're talking to students and they have and they make comments like that or express concerns like that, I really like the way you phrased it about expressing yourself and articulation of your own beliefs, even if that doesn't impact an outcome.
And actually, Eric, it's great to use New York as an example of whether we do have power or not, because actually we have quite a number of Republican representatives to Congress. And they have been part of the Trump's team that's really passed legislation in the country that's going to harm New York in the long run. And so I think we should not assume, if we really believe in those conservative principles, we should make sure those Republicans stay in Congress. If we think that's not the right direction to go in, we should be voting to send new representatives to Congress. So we might look blue, but we have a lot of Republican representatives because we are a diverse state and we have a lot of small rural communities in New York. I think the other thing to remember is right now, as we approach the midterm, less than 60% of the eligible voters turned out to vote in the presidential election, which means that all our candidates, not just the president, but everyone representing us, was voted in by just over half of the eligible voters. So if you say your vote doesn't count, it's not counting because 40% of people aren't showing up to vote. If all 40% of them showed up, it would change the dynamics. New York State in that election was lower than most, with only 52.4% of eligible voters voting in the presidential campaign. So I think we really have to look at the data and help push aside this idea of whose vote counts.
So how are voting issues and topics incorporated in the classroom? I know there's a lot of different things within the School of Social Welfare, with the summer reading that students had done about voting and the importance of it. So what's being done in the classrooms?
So one of the things I'm very proud of about the school is that we have a summer reading for our students about different topics. And this year we chose the book Give Us the Ballot, A History of the Voting Rights Act by Ari Berman. And one of the reasons we chose this book is to remind students that it was not that long ago, it was in the 50s and 60s, that African Americans really did not have the right to vote. They might have had the right to vote, but they did not have access to the ballot box or to register. And that's the grandparents of the students in our program now. And so helping students see that it's within their own families that people were kept from the ballot box, I think, is really important. Another is barriers to voting. How are we, if we really believe in democracy, in the role of one vote for every person, how are our policies, laws, and rules really holding people back? So I think as social workers, policy is practice and practice is policy. And I think it's a way of helping people think about, gosh, I didn't realize that states or even counties or local jurisdictions could set policies that would bar people in certain geographic areas from having access to the ballot box. It resulted in some very rich conversations among our students, and hopefully many of them will go back and ask their grandparents about their experiences with voting as well.
I'm curious if you see differences in the students of today and the students of, say, 5 years ago and 10 years ago. Do you think voting, voter registration, voter mobilization, voter access, the history of voting rights and that struggle, do you think students are more aware now, less aware? Do you think this is, do you see any changes? I'm just curious about your more longitudinal view.
Yeah, I actually think students today are more openly interested in social justice issues.
Okay.
And so if we can begin to link voting, democracy, speech to those social justice issues, I think that's really capturing young students' imaginations. And I think 5-8 years ago, there was a kind of complacency about those things, that the current times have really raised people's awareness. So I think we can capitalize on that with our students today.
And interestingly, I think of voting as a first step. I think of voting as something, it's exercising your right as a citizen, but it's a first step toward involvement, whatever that involvement might look like. And so I guess I'm wondering, when you work particularly with undergraduate students here on the campus, do you see students going beyond voting, where they are actually getting involved in, say, volunteer efforts to register others to vote, or are they getting involved politically or in advocacy or community engagement type efforts?
I think the advocacy and community engagement, yes. And I just want to talk a little about what's happening at UAlbany, because
Great.
I think that creates a larger context for this conversation, which is that the Office of Student Affairs is leading a voter registration and engagement effort. It's called UAlbany Votes. The role of that group is to advance civic engagement initiatives across the campus, develop innovative and inclusive ideas that can be implemented, and creating a culture of civic engagement. And as a result of leadership of young people like Cheryl Simmons on this campus, who knows how to use social media like Alyssa does, and I don't, that many more students are all of a sudden popping up. So there's this whole group of public administration undergrads that self-organized to create UAlbany Votes. Our BSWA students are going to hold voter registration drives on the downtown campus.
Okay.
And that has never really happened before in a long time on the campus.
Right.
So I think there is a new intersection between these ideas of social justice and really a right to vote.
So maybe part of what I hear you saying is that social justice can be the hook that gets people interested in this topic and gets folks to see that if politics and the news and things that we see on the news seem remote, if they seem not related to one's life, particularly for undergraduate life, where life tends to be focused around the campus and around learning and a little insular at times, that social justice and belief in social justice might be a hook that could get people interested.
Exactly, because even if they're not reading the news, they see the injustices through their social media feed. So that, I think, it speaks to our emotions and our passions, and I think students really get engaged around those ideas. So police shootings of young black men, or environmental injustices, or the climate change. I mean, we have this huge storm bearing down on North Carolina right now that is going to could have devastating impacts, and I think students really see that's very alive for them. And so how does voting relate to those issues?
Right.
Now, we talked a little bit about what UAlbany is doing, but there's a lot of things that universities across the country are doing. One of the things that I'm looking at right now is the Voting is Social Work campaign. And it's pretty much saying that voting is central to social work's values and social justice mission, and it gives individuals and communities the power to voice their opinions and affect change. So can you give us like sort of an overview of what's happening across the country? Because it seems like people are more and more active right now in trying to get students to vote and trying to get universities to really embrace, what's happening today.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alyssa. And I think for years now, there's been an institute at the University of Connecticut called the Humphreys Institute for Political Action, founded by Nancy Humphreys, really one of the great social work leaders in our country. And through that institute, they've really started to work with the Association of Community Organizing Social Workers, ACOSA, Hunter College, Mimi Abramowitz, who's a really well-known writer in these areas on women's rights and policy, and begun to organize schools of social work around the country, and joined by NASW, our National Association of Social Workers, and the Council of Social Work Education, which accredits schools of social work. Everyone has come together in this coalition to say, we really need students, faculty, people to be engaged in our civic responsibilities. And one of the things that we know is that there is a school of social work in every congressional district in the United States.
Interesting.
So that becomes a huge way to help students understand there's a direct relationship between who gets elected to public office and the health of your university and college and your education and the education of people in your community. So I think it's through leadership from the Humphrey Institute, ACOSA, CSWE, and NASW that schools of social work have really responded to this call to action.
So I'm curious, Mary, if you could talk a little bit about the concept of partisanship and how that plays a role now, because I often think in a profession like social work, sometimes, and even in higher education, sometimes there is a tendency to want to reach a wide variety of students and a wide variety of community members by not being partisan and by trying to reach the interests of people across a range of perspectives and positions. So has there been a reluctance of social work and other professions to get involved in voting and politics because of its partisan nature?
Not for NASW, the National Association of Social Workers. They've had a separate political action group since the early 90s.
Okay.
So I think we really grew out of Mary Richmond, Jane Addams, the kind of tension between the two, case to cause, cause to case.
Yeah.
And I think that legacy has reminded us about the role of policy. Policy is practice. Well, where does policy come from but our elected representatives? So I think what all associations and groups in this country have to do is look at the issues and not the person's registration. There are many Republicans who have done really heroic leadership work on mental health parity, on gay and lesbian rights, because their children were gay or lesbian, or because they had a daughter who was mentally ill. Like, these social issues don't discriminate. All families experience them. And I think as social workers, we want people representing us who will serve the clients that we serve in the communities that we serve. And I think NASW in particular has really worked hard to look at the issues and what the person stands for as opposed to their enrollment.
Okay, great.
And before we get into how our listeners can get involved, what are some barriers to voting?
Yeah, so there are a number of them, and I feel like they're growing by the day, which really worries me, because we were founded on this principle of one person, one vote. But some are very confusing registration and identification requirements, whether people actually have to show picture ID, even if they're officially registered, we know who they are, do they have to actually pull out a picture ID when they show up to vote? If they haven't voted in several years, can their name be taken off the rolls, which requires re-registration? Polling places change, so how is information communicated? I've heard stories of polling places changing the week before an election and no notification going out. So people show up, they don't have cars, and now the new polling place is 5 miles away and they have no way of getting there. Long lines, lack of information on candidates and what the issues are. The ballots change all the time. Sometimes you actually have to flip the ballot over and vote for a referendum on the back of a ballot. Who's helping people to understand how these are set up?
And it's true, but sometimes I even go into the polls and I'm like, well, this is different, and I'm looking at it, and even though I might be not more knowledgeable on the voting process and what's going on, I still even am looking sometimes like, did I do that right? I don't even know. And it's confusing.
Exactly. So I think there are many, many ways that other countries have set up voting that makes it much clearer and simpler. So one is, the minute you register a car or apply for a driver's license, you are automatically registered to vote. That it goes seamlessly into the voter registration rolls. That people have the opportunity when they change their address through their license or through their car registration, that change of address automatically goes to voter registration. We are the only country that does not have voting on a weekend to make it easy for people with hourly wage jobs to vote. All other countries have voting on a weekend. Why do we have it on a Tuesday? There are many things that are done in ways that make you wonder, are they purposefully done to ensure that only certain people actually show up to vote? So I think home voting, Oregon has a fantastic mail-in ballot system now for the whole state. You don't even have to apply for it. The ballot comes to your house, you vote on your kitchen table, you put it in an envelope, and you send it back in. That allows you to look at the ballot and really understand, how is this ballot designed? So I think there are many ways as a country that we could reduce the barriers to voting if we really wanted everyone to vote.
Yeah.
And if students are interested in helping to raise awareness about these issues, if they're interested in getting involved in voting rights issues, how would they do that?
Yeah, so a great way is to go on TurboVote and actually register. It's an app that you can register on, and if you register through TurboVote, you will get automatic text notifications before an election, before the primary. If you need to get an absentee ballot, they'll send it to you with a stamped self-addressed envelope. And the University at Albany is really promoting the use of TurboVote to help students get much more engaged. If you go on TurboVote and you're not registered, but you have a license, you just put your license number into the TurboVote app, and they will automatically populate a voter registration form for you that you can simply then check what party you want to belong to and send it in. So TurboVote as an app is really spectacular, and you can go on the University at Albany website to the Office of Student Affairs and get the link to TurboVote, or you can just type in on your browser, turbovote.org, and go right there.
And as we have our final question before we bring on our next guest, for those listening, how can they get involved? Is there any last minute tips or suggestions or something you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, one of the most enjoyable things that any of us can do is, if there's a candidate that we're particularly interested in after today's primary, call them up and say, do you need volunteers? Because there are many, many tasks that candidates need before Election Day, such as phone calls, phone banks, leafleting, going to the farmers market and helping them shake hands, walking your neighborhood with a candidate. And I think it's something you could do for an hour or 2 hours when you have the time. And it's an easy way for you to get to know the human beings behind the candidates.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. Primary day, and if you're living in Albany, it is 12 o'clock noon that the polls open, so you can head there pretty soon after the show. Mary, thank you so much for coming on and giving us a really good overview of what's happening in the university and sort of what's going on nationally at schools and colleges and how we're getting students to vote and showing the importance of it. Because I think sometimes, how you said, people get in this mindset that maybe my vote doesn't count, or why should I care about this if it's not a presidential election, or why does this matter? And it does matter. And thank you for all the efforts you've been doing at the School of Social Welfare and with the university to help really have students see this impact and helping to arrange the voter registration tables with students. So it's making a difference, and I want to thank you for that.
And thank you both for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mary. It's wonderful to have a faculty leader on the radio show with us, and a faculty leader who's inspiring students to vote themselves, to register others to vote, to become civically engaged, and just to think about these issues in a deeper way, and to think that maybe education is not just what happens in the classroom, but it's also how students get involved in the community. And I think that's part of what your leadership is doing. So I think UAlbany students are very fortunate to have you as part of the faculty, and we look forward to hearing more about these efforts in the future.
Great.
We hope you'll return.
But don't leave us, listeners, because even though Mary's stepping out, we do have another guest. We'll have Joe Bonilla, who is the managing partner, senior media director, and co-founder of the PR and communications firm Relentless Awareness. So really excited to have him on after the break. So definitely don't leave us.
We will have a short commercial interruption here, and by that I mean a public service announcement, and then we will have Joe Bonilla with us back on the Social Workers Radio Talk Show.